Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Things College and Career, the podcast to turn to for all of your college and career planning needs. We are your hosts, Meg Gary
and Bobby Ryan,
owners of academic and career advising services located in Kennebunk, Maine.
We started this podcast to provide helpful information to listeners researching careers, colleges, or academic majors. Choosing your career or college is such a big decision, which is why our motto is learn before you leap. Before investing a lot of time or money, it's so important to do your research and to really explore your options.
Each podcast will offer interesting stories and valuable insights that we think you will find entertaining and informative.
Subscribe to our podcast and you'll have it ready to go on your playlist every Monday morning. So, learn before you leap each week with us.
Today, we welcome two registered architects to our podcast, M.Keller and Annelise Aldrich, owners of the architectural firm TYP Architects.
Yeah, and their architectural firm designs net zero homes that are affordable, healthy, and will last for 200 plus years, basically forever.
Exactly.
And, by the way, TYP stands for Tend Your Planet, and I love that. How about you?
I love that too. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So if you are interested in becoming an architect, then this podcast is for you. Mark and Annie will tell you everything that you need to know.
Also, if you need an architect, you will want to tune in because you cannot find more highly qualified architects than Mark and Annie.
That's for sure. So enough of our intro, Bobby. Let's get started with our conversation with Mark and Annie.
All right, Meg, let's do it.
Hello, M.Keller and Annelise Aldrich. Welcome to All Things College and Career. Thanks so much for doing the podcast today.
Thanks for having us. We're excited.
Hello.
Hello, Annie. Hi, Mark. Hey, where are we talking to you guys from today?
Well, we're in sunny Ellensburg, Washington. If you haven't been, which you should, it's about 2 hours east of Seattle.
Nice.
Okay, so on the west coast.
In the mountains, or?
You go through the mountains, and Ellensburg is, I would say it's kind of like a high plateau through the mountains. Would you describe that, Annie, the same way?
Yeah, exactly. It's a little bit of a plateau just east of the primary mountain range, the Cascades, that runs through the state.
Oh, sounds beautiful. We'll definitely have to make a trip out there.
Yeah.
We're going to get right into what we want our listeners to know about, which is what it's like to become an architect. So to start this off, we're going to ask you guys 3 things that you love about your job as an architect. And Annie, let's start with you.
Okay, sounds good. Well, I think that I'll try to keep this brief because I could go on and on. We really do love our jobs.
Right.
But I think one top thing is the creativity, the fact that we really do get to draw, we get to think about space, we get to think about materials, and there really is sort of an artistic, creative aspect to our work. That's one thing. Second thing is the multidisciplinarity of it. I myself spent a little bit of time in landscape design as well as architectural design, and I've worked on towers and homes and restaurants and stores and just all sorts of different projects. And that really just brings you into different sorts of specialists and other professionals.
Yeah, so you're not going to get bored.
No, it is always something new to learn throughout the profession. And then the third thing is scalability. Again, that sort of links in with the multidisciplinarity, but we've worked in different cities. I've worked on projects literally around the world while working at other firms. And you get to consider everything from individuals' personal space, how they want to put their clothes away at night, where they want to eat breakfast, all the way up to how whole communities interact.
Yeah. Wow.
I love, those are the 3 things.
That's a lot to think about. That's a large scope, and interesting that that's how you have to spend your days and time thinking of that sort of thing. That's so cool. I love that.
Hopefully you don't have to do it all at once.
Yeah, no.
It definitely sounds like it would be helpful to break it down a bit.
So how about you, Mark? What are your 3 things you would say you would love about being an architect?
Yeah, I had a hunch you guys were going to ask this, and we talked about this before the podcast, so we actually had the exact same 3 things that we agreed on that we liked about it.
No way! Did you come up with them separately and then converse? And
well, we argued a little bit, and then we agreed. But I was thinking about one more when Annie was answering the question, which was, this isn't necessarily inherent in the field of architecture, but the position we're in with having our own firm, you get to choose a problem or difficult difficult thing in life and tackle it if you want to.
Right.
And so we have friends that are working on social justice through architecture. We have friends that are working on like building technology and performance through architecture. We're working on climate crisis through architecture. And it's really cool to just be able to put your head to something that you're passionate about and do it through the lens of your field.
Yeah. And that is a huge benefit to your profession, that you're able to combine something you are passionate about with your career. And we are going to get into just how your firm TYP or TYP does that. But first, we want to start at the onset of your careers. How did you choose architecture as your course of study? And either of you can go first.
Okay, I'll go first.
Yep.
I had the opportunity as a young person, I think I was about 13 years old, to spend a little bit of time with a friend of my dad who was actually a nautical designer. He designed sailboats, and he let me use his drafting tools and let me kind of just play around in his studio and come up with a hypothetical design for his cabin. And I, as a young girl, was imaginative and really ran with that and started just drawing all kinds of houses. And so it was pretty clear that I was interested in homes and dwelling and drawing in plan and in section as I was a young person. So I continued to overlay that with things as I grew up. And going into college, I was one of those people that wanted about 5 different majors.
Right.
I wanted to study all kinds of different stuff at once.
Yeah, a lot of things
I was really overwhelmed.
You.
Exactly. Yeah. I wanted to study language and philosophy and environmental science and architecture and art. And,
Right.
And so I did have to pick. But I think that the reason I ended up honing in on architecture is because it allowed me to do all of those things, really. Not as much of a detailed way as picking a single profession of that list, but when we do different projects in different regions, we do research climate and ecology and geology and anthropology, the history of a place, and we do get to think about interpersonal conditions and a little bit of philosophy and psychology as we design spaces for people. So it really is a nice umbrella to bring in a lot of different facets.
I've never stopped to think about that with architecture.
I know. You're making us look at
really
architecture in a whole new light. Yeah. And I love that.
There's always time for a career change.
Yeah, right. Well, I might listen to this podcast
I know.
to make a change. You never know.
Quit your job as the co-host. And
That's right. No, can't do that. But...
Can't do that. Exactly. No. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. How about you, Mark? How did you decide to go into architecture?
Yeah, well, I feel like I can't justify my past self with a kind of post-rationalized story about how I was meant to be an architect and I was always into it. I think Annie's story of how she started is beautiful, but I don't really have that.
Most people don't.
I was not. Yeah,
Right.
I was kind of confused and I wasn't ever good or interested in art, and I was kind of into math and science.
Right.
So I thought I was going to go into engineering until I didn't do well in engineering. So I transferred into the architecture school, but that was after people had told me expressly, don't go into architecture. You're not made to do it.
Oh, my goodness.
And I just kind of ended up there. And I really wish I had some sort of resource like you're doing to help with that decision earlier.
Oh,
That would have been excellent.
Yeah, and we've heard that expressed to us before, and that is exactly why we're doing this podcast.
I had 3 different adults tell me I shouldn't be an architect also.
Now, what were their reasons?
I ended up completing the major.
That's so interesting.
They were various. One of them was that this woman just knew it was a tough profession, that there were long hours and tough decisions being in the position of client service. Another person said that it just didn't pay that well. And I don't know why another person said that she just didn't think it would work out for me, I think.
So both of you just bucked the advice and went on into architecture anyway.
I guess.
Good for you.
And we both have reflected upon pre-graduating from school and been like, the words that adults give to kids are so formative at certain times, and they just don't realize that they're telling people this, and it's going to stick with them.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. We don't realize how formative.
Right. And it, like Mark says, at certain times, because you can be giving advice all day long and 99% of it just goes right out in one ear and out the other. But there's those certain moments that
where it
sticks. Yeah.
Gosh, that puts a lot of pressure
It's a
on
lot of pressure on parents.
on parents, But
Yeah, and it's just all the advice, like bad advice I look back on from adults when I was a kid. It's always just things that people said with certainty.
Yeah.
Like, don't do this or do this, and there was no nuance. So I guess I just hope there's more nuance in what I tell people. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's good advice. And I like the tip that, hey, even if everybody is telling you not to do something, if this is where your head's taking you and your heart, then you got to jump in.
Well,
you got to go for it.
Yeah.
And we're so glad that neither of you followed any of that advice, because you're just truly, truly gifted and amazing architects. So there's that.
Let's get into the colleges you both chose. So Mark, we know you went to UVA, and Annie, you went to California College of the Arts. What made you choose those schools? And Mark, this time we'll start with you.
Great. Well, again, it had nothing to do with architecture.
Right.
So I don't really know if you want to hear about that decision process.
Well, we do a little, because our listeners, they're figuring things out too. So I think it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree, Bobby. But also, just for anyone that might be thinking about going to UVA, or for grad school, you went to Michigan. And Annie, anybody that's thinking about California College of the Arts, we'd love to just share a few tidbits. So maybe something what they could expect if they went there.
Sure. Well, I was deciding between UVA, which, Virginia was far from New Hampshire, where I grew up. So it was great to get away from the parents.
And
that was great. And also the weather's pretty nice down there.
It's really nice,
And I know I was trying to decide between that and a couple schools further north, so I went south towards the sun. But I think the really positive thing about UVA, besides, has deep history and culture, and Charlottesville is a beautiful area, so I highly recommend it. But a public university offered so much more diverse courses of study, student groups, activities than I would have gotten in a lot of different colleges that I was selecting from. So I really appreciated that experience.
Yeah. And UVA is an excellent school.
Yeah. The architecture program at UVA has continued to perform very strongly in terms of, rankings, although who knows how much rankings matter, right? But it does have a good reputation, especially for the undergraduate study there.
Yeah. And then you went on to Michigan.
I did. In Michigan, wasn't quite so warm.
A little work break in between, right, Mark? You worked for a couple of years in between. And just quickly, before we get on to Michigan, I just want to ask you if that's something you would recommend to others that are considering the master's degree in architecture. If they would take a couple of years to work first before going on, or how would you approach that in hindsight?
Sure. So the setup here is that if you're looking to get licensed as an architect, eventually you either have to do a 4-year degree like I did, and then go back for a master's degree, which is what I ended up doing. And Annie can speak to her path, which was different. And she just got all 5 years of a professional degree from one school at once. So those are the two paths you can select from.
Okay. That's great to know.
That is great to know. I'm glad we have 2 different paths on our podcast today. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah. And it will help you select from the school types. Typically, and this is not at all a rule, but typically more technical programs are a 5-year track, whereas university type programs or more liberal arts oriented programs tend to be a 4+2 year track. But Michigan, I did work. I worked in North Carolina, and then I went up to New York City for a couple of years. So I had, I guess, 3.5 years of work in between undergraduate and graduate. And I did notice, and I hope none of my friends who went straight from undergrad to grad are listening, but I did notice in grad school, the people with some work experience tended to be more confident, and they tended to graduate and more immediately start working in a capacity that they wanted. And I don't know if it's a confidence thing or if it's strictly because they already had work experience, but I definitely would recommend at least 1 or 2 years in between.
That seems so logical that if you did have a couple of years under your belt, that you would have more confidence. That just seems to make total sense.
Yeah, and I think you kind of know more what you want and what you're after in that graduate degree than you would have coming right out of. Yep.
Their projects were better in graduate school sometimes because, not all the time, but they did kind of think through things a little differently than the students who hadn't had any work experience, for sure.
That's awesome. And Mark, you would probably never share this with our listening audience, but I'm going to that. Didn't you graduate from Michigan with honors?
Something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. But anyway.
He graduated from both of his programs with honors.
Oh, thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Annie. So I'm just letting our listeners know if they need an architect, he comes highly qualified. They both come very highly qualified, and you'd be lucky to have them. But anyway, so let's move on to Annie. And I'm loving that you had a different experience. So we'd love to hear about the California College of Arts and what your experience was like there, and if you would recommend it to listeners.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm going to step back a second or a little bit before I ended up at, I'll call it CCA, California College of the Arts.
Okay.
For brevity.
Yeah, we like
that. Before I enrolled there, I actually started out at a different university, at the University of San Francisco. I spent a year there, and that is the Jesuit liberal arts school. Mm-hmm. And before that, I really picked going to San Francisco as my college experience. I think that for me, it was actually less about the specific school, and it was more about the place and the experience I knew I would have.
More about where you wanted to go.
Exactly, yeah. And I had a great and absolutely wonderful time in San Francisco in that time of my life and in that time of San Francisco. So it worked out from that point of view. And so I started at the University of San Francisco looking for a liberal arts education because that's what my dad told me I should do. And I didn't know what I wanted to do at that point, and very quickly transferred into their architecture program. And then, within a year had decided that I wanted to go to CCA because they had a much more rigorous and immersive curriculum for architecture. They had more students. And of course, they had all of the other artistic disciplines and design disciplines that they hosted.
Which you were interested in.
Definitely. I wanted to take other classes, and I wanted to be around the students who were just more creative and passionate about the work that they were doing. So for me, in a way, transferring to CCA was kind of like a really long campus visit. Like I had a friend there, so I was able to go and sort of test out what it was like to be a student. So I would also say to people who are doing college visits or considering choosing a college, go to class and really talk to people, spend some time on campus, because that completely changed my impression of both schools after I had been in classes and been with students at both campuses. So that was important. But then,
and I think also another lesson to take away is don't be afraid to make that move if you need to, because sometimes it's beneficial to you.
Definitely. Yes.
I think at 17, you don't really know what's a good fit, and you're just testing things out and learning about yourself. So to make that move sounded like it was a really good move for you. So
yeah.
I'm glad you weren't afraid to make it, I guess is the point.
Yes, me too in hindsight. And I'm glad my parents supported me making it and everything. So I spent 6 years in my undergraduate program in total. 5 of those were dedicated to a professional degree in the Bachelor of Architecture, as Mark spoke to. So that entitled me to, I became a registered architect years later. I didn't need to go get a master's degree because I already had all the accredited degree that I needed from that Bachelor of Architecture.
Right. So that's a fantastic way to do it and save yourself a little time and money.
Definitely. Yeah.
So you both are registered architects. So what is involved in becoming a registered architect?
So you have to graduate from an accredited degree it's called NAAB. So if you're going to a college and they're not certified by this organization, then
that's a red flag.
You should look to go to a college before
you need
you're certified by that organization.
You need to switch. So that's a great tip, listeners.
And they will definitely be transparent about that. Everyone who is certified is very open. And there are resources you can go to online to find all the colleges who are certified. It's very easy. But once you graduate from either a 5-year degree or a 4+2, and actually concurrently with that education, you can start to accumulate hours. And it's called the internship. And everything in work as an architect you do before you get registered is technically an internship. Okay. Even if you're not working as a summer intern, it's a confusing term, but you're technically an intern until you're registered. And you need about 3,700 total hours of internship in various categories.
Yeah, that's quite a bit. Yep.
Yeah. And some people can get it done in a year and a half if you're very aggressive about your hours and get lucky with the experience that you have. Others 2 to 3 to even 4 years. It just depends on getting those 6 different categories of work finished and getting someone to sign off on those hours.
Right. So when you say the 6 different categories, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, they actually just overhauled, and by they I mean NCARB. It's NCARB, and that's the board that kind of supervises this whole process. They just overhauled this system. So I think it makes a lot of sense how they're doing it now. And actually, there are fewer hours than when I went through it. So I'm a little bit upset about that. The bar has been lowered.
And that never happens. That never happens.
I know. Usually it's the other way.
No, it's upsetting. So I'll just list them real quickly. They're practice management, project management, programming and analysis, project planning and design, project development and documentation, and construction evaluation. And your hours aren't split evenly across those. There are some that require a lot more hours than others. But it's cool how they've done this because those 6 categories are actually the same 6 categories that after you finish your internship, you're taking your tests. There are 6 tests, one for each of those categories.
6 tests. Oh my gosh.
So, those categories become relevant right there.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you can start to think in those terms and prepare for the tests kind of subconsciously.
Are the tests difficult to pass?
It depends on who you ask. But I'm looking at the pass rates, and some of them have about 50% pass rates.
Wow.
46%. The highest one has 70%. Yeah.
If you fail a section, you just have to retake that one section, right? Not the whole.
Right.
Yeah. So that's good, at least.
People tend to take them multiple times. You have to wait a certain amount of time in between taking them, and it's a lot of money and time studying. So you definitely want to study as hard as possible for these tests.
So when you hire a registered architect, that's a pretty big hurdle to clear. So that must give people confidence about your abilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like that's a lot to go through to get that certification.
There's one last phase to the certification, which is that you have to pass a short state-based exam as well. And different states have different additional requirements. For example, California has pretty significant fire and earthquake safety requirements that you are tested on, in addition to the NCARB tests, which are the national passing tests.
Wow, that's something to consider as well then. So, and probably every state has its own test, right?
To some degree, yeah. Washington State's is much shorter. It really just had to do with state law. You just needed to be familiar with the laws governing professional operations.
That makes sense, but I can see why California includes the earthquake and fire because both are big issues and must be important when you're designing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you've passed this test, this board, I'll call it, is that it? Other than getting different state licenses, do you have to renew it or take it again in 10 years? Or is there any ongoing requirements for testing?
Unfortunately, you don't have to relive the tests over and over again. Once you were tested, you don't have to. However, there is something called continuing education. And that is kind of like being tested. No, you have to fulfill a number of hours of continuing education every year. And again, that varies by state. It's usually in the realm of 16 to 24 hours a year. Every 2 years. And that is what you have to fulfill in order to renew your registration in a state, which is usually on a yearly or biannual schedule.
Right.
You can do it in a lot of different ways. You can even do it by self-study. So, for example, we just spent a lot of time deeply researching some different building techniques. That counted as continuing education because we really were learning. Other people go to seminars or do webinars, or a lot of offices provide things called lunch and learns, where they have outside course providers come in and talk for an hour during lunch. And that's a really easy way to get your continuing education.
Sounds like your approach was a bit tougher, but as you said, you got a lot out of it and it keeps you current, I would imagine. So it's probably a good thing.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah.
So the last question I wanted to ask you as it pertains to studying to become an architect is if you have any tips or sage words of advice for anyone considering this course of study, or if you think a certain type of personality seems best suited for this path.
I think that's an excellent question. We were actually asking ourselves this question just the other day. I think in terms of personalities, you can be any personality. That doesn't have an effect. You just approach the field in a different way, and that's fine. No one should be dissuaded for having a certain personality, in my mind. But I'm going to take the question in a slightly different direction, which is things that I wish someone had told me to think about, or I wish I had realized about going into architecture.
Great way to approach it.
And I guess one thing is when I was in school, I didn't realize the bias the program had embedded in it. And so I would say question everything. And by that, I mean, for example, my school thought that to create a building, you need to first create a really clear diagram, something that you can draw in 5 minutes or less, and that everything follows from that diagram linearly. And so when you present a building, you have your diagram sketch, and then you can rationalize everything. But who said a building is a diagram, or that people experience space through diagrams?
Right.
Like it's
lot
clearly
of people
ridiculous to me at this point.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's how I was educated. And there's a whole bunch of architects out there drawing diagrams. So I would just highly recommend really be critical about everything in your experience.
Right, because that approach might not speak to you. That might not be the way you artistically can approach a project. And you have to kind of find your own way that makes sense, probably.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Absolutely. And I would also secondarily really quickly say school, other people have different experiences, but school for me was 90% really working spaces, understanding how to shape spaces, thinking spatially, drawing through plans. And I loved that practice, but what I'm doing now as an architect is maybe 10% of that. I would just want someone to have told me that that's not all architecture is. There's much more.
Well, that little piece of advice could have just made a big difference to an architectural student listening to this. So what would the other 90 be?
Yeah, the other 90%, what is it in the practice? Yeah, Annie, maybe you want to pick this up, but I guess I would it includes material research. It includes
interesting.
Finances and economics. It includes detailing, how things go together in construction. And I didn't do that in school at all.
Right. Wow.
Annie, do you want to add?
There's a general understanding, I think, within architectural pedagogy that you don't learn technical knowledge in school.
Yeah.
That you're supposed to learn how to design in school. And, there's a balance there. Obviously, it's helpful to learn both sorts of things. But I think Mark and I both actually feel from our programs that they emphasized the things like diagrams, the sort of overlay on design, not even really truly design, but sort of this weird conjured up idea of how you're supposed to be designing too much, and didn't explain enough the importance of technical aspects and really celebrate that either. We only got to get into that in our jobs later on.
I want to add really quickly on this point because I think it's really important for people considering this field. Both programs I was in, there was a crisis of pedagogy, and I think it's still going on. And there is a big argument about this. How much should schooling reflect practice? And that's one of the arguments. And there's kind of an old school liberal arts vantage point that no school is different. It should be different. We should celebrate that. And there's a different approach where, no, we should actually prepare architects for the real world. And I remember in grad school, I had multiple professors saying, this field you're in, this program will not continue to exist as it has or as it is, and you need to be ready to change.
Yeah. Well, if it's any comfort to either of you, having done this podcast, it seems like so many people we interview learn their job on the job and not in school, basically.
Right. But the school, the degree gets them the job.
Or provides them with a foundation from which to thrive or to grow or to be trainable.
But I think my takeaway of that, too, is that if you're going to go into an architecture program, really, really try to figure out what their philosophy is, their teaching philosophy, and how they're going to prepare you for this job.
So that's career. Something for potential students to look at, right?
Absolutely.
Well, those are great tips. I appreciate that. So let's turn our attention to TYP. And this is the name of your architectural firm. And just love the name. And can you tell us a little bit about the name, why you named it TYP and what that stands for?
So TYP stands for Tend Your Planet. And one of the things having your own firm affords you is the ability to focus on what you care about. And we think the number one only thing that matters to our generation and should be to everyone is the climate crisis that's happening currently. So our entire firm is about that. And we sat down and scratched our heads and we're like, okay, this should be easy. We'll just design things that are sustainable. Like, done. Why isn't everyone doing this?
Right.
But it turns out it's extremely complicated and there's so much to it. What is sustainability? How do you design buildings that are sustainable? There's a lot of greenwashing, things that say they're sustainable, but in fact, they're just getting marketing points from that.
Right.
But they're not.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated field, but we think we've kind of hit upon solutions that don't add cost, they add value.
Oh, I love that.
And that's our kind of approach here. Yeah.
Maybe we could ask Annie, can you talk a little bit about what those features are that add value and not cost?
Sure, yeah. I'll preface by saying when we started the firm, we knew we wanted to do work that we felt deeply passionate about, and our imperative is to address climate change, absolutely. But we didn't know exactly what the work product would look like or where that would take us following that. So luckily, the projects that we've been able to pursue during our firm's tenure have led us to a lot of research and a lot of understanding about these things that we think add value and not necessarily cost. And so what they are specifically are structural techniques, ways of building that take common practice and transition them into something that's more efficient, uses less material, can go up more quickly, therefore protects materials better. They're kind of like common sense efficiencies applied to buildings. And so that's one thing is structure. And the second thing is the envelope sort of outside of the building. This really comes down to material choices and their application to each other. So you can frequently think of the exterior walls of a building like a sandwich where there's, bread, mayo, mustard, lettuce, tomato, and cheese, what have you.
Gotta have the cheese.
You can arrange those layers in different sequences. And the sequence that you arrange the layers has a huge impact on energy performance and waterproofing performance for the structure. And that then impacts how much energy you're using, how long the structure is going to exist, which in turn that impacts obviously climate change and the way that we as humans are impacting the planet. Wow. So we are really trying to perfect a couple techniques. Well, ideally perfect, but there's probably no such thing as perfection, certainly not in architecture. Make them as high performing as possible so that we can provide the best buildings as we can for people.
Oh, I love that. That's so ambitious of you and so forward thinking. And I think there's got to be a huge demand for that sort of architecture going forward.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. We hope so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's how it should be going.
Yeah. Yes. We hope there's demand, but we hope it's not... how to say this. We hope it doesn't come more quickly than the industry can handle. We were just reading this report. I think it was put together by King County, which is the county Seattle is in. And they were assessing why so many of their sustainable agendas meet resistance. And basically, Annie, you can speak to this a little more articulately, but construction professionals just want to do what they've always been doing. They don't want to try anything new. And it's risky to try new things, even if it's going to save money and it's going to make a better, more sustainable product. So things move slowly here, unfortunately.
People are comfortable and people don't like to change when they're comfortable with how they do things.
They're used to certain products and certain ways of doing things, and getting people to change, I'm sure, must be like an uphill battle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Certainly.
But we need to do it. There's no option.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, there is no option.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that just came to mind that I want to add to that is there's a lot of misinformation about what sustainable or green design is and about what custom design and what architects do. And so we started doing this in school. We've done it in our prior jobs, and we're certainly doing it with TYP, is learning how to effectively communicate and how to sort of subtly educate people along the way. We were just talking to a builder recently, and it was very clear that in his mind, green design was very closely knitted with high cost and a lot of fancy doodads, basically.
Yeah.
What?
And so we really had to work to decouple those impressions from him in order to have a clear conversation about what we're trying to do. And so I cannot underscore enough the importance of language and finding the right communication tool and utilizing pretty much anything at your disposal, including drawings and visual images and examples and technical literature. It really takes a lot to be clear about what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And I think it's going to take time. I just kind of envision the situation where you guys design a very sustainable home and it goes to a builder that is used to building traditional homes. He gets your design, right? So it's going to be an education process. But once that builder builds this home, right, he's got that in his tool belt, his or her, and he can then move forward. That's in his resume now, and it's got to be the trend. They've got to know this trend is coming.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think even if the builder in question rejects sustainable building techniques, I think in the next 10 or fewer years, they're going to see a lot of builders around them embrace it and be able to sell their buildings for more because the market demands it.
Exactly.
And
it's either
supersede them.
Either get on the train or you're going to be left behind, right?
Yeah, I do feel that way.
And it's interesting what you mentioned, Annie, about people assuming the cost is going to be greater, because I suppose if you think about just buying a car, a lot of the electric cars and things like that tend to be more expensive than a comparable car.
The upfront cost.
Upfront costs, yeah. So I can see where people immediately draw that parallel, but you're saying that's not necessarily true.
It doesn't have to be true. And one good example is maybe just energy and appliances. So, for example, there's a local power provider called Puget Sound Energy, and they offer to customers an option where you can specifically buy solar, wind, and hydro power that is not produced using fossil fuels, which is great, but it costs a little bit more. But they also offer rebates for high efficiency appliances. So if you look at a bigger picture where you're saying, okay, my goal is to reduce my carbon footprint on the planet, how am I going to do that? You pay a little bit more for your power rates, but you get more efficient appliances, and maybe you add a couple solar panels, and it can balance out to a place where in the long run, those adjustments, the cost of appliances, the cost of solar panels pay for themselves because you're using less power, over the course of several years. And so it's that sort of bigger picture thinking that I think is really helpful when you consider the idea of value versus cost.
Right.
I think you're so right on that point, Annie. It is about value instead of upfront cost. And that's the fundamental shift that's hard for people to grasp. And the equation has become a lot more simple over the years. So solar panels can now pay back for themselves in 2 years.
Really?
Which is unbelievable.
Wow, that's amazing.
And
so that's like a no-brainer almost.
It is a no-brainer. And, it obviously varies by pointing it in the right direction and having enough sun, right? But it's somewhat a no-brainer. And the other thing to consider is upfront, we'll call them energy costs, but it's just carbon emissions. Upfront energy costs of a building are, say, 10%, but the operational costs of over the lifespan of that building, the energy it takes to maintain it and the maintenance of it are more like 90%, 9 to 10 times higher than those costs. So if you can take your energy expense over the lifetime of the building and have some solar panels, for example, that pay back for themselves, you are doing a lot of work that most people are not doing to offset your footprint.
Wow, that's amazing. That's such an interesting thing to think about too, the maintenance cost and that sort of thing.
So I saw on your webpage that you guys are meeting the 2030 challenge today. Can you tell us what the 2030 challenge is?
Yeah, so the 2030 challenge, basically there is a current amount of energy efficiency in buildings. And basically that is what it takes to keep the building running in terms of energy. And that comes down to insulating the building, comes down to having passive solar heating by having windows facing the right direction, things like that. It also comes down to solar panels or geothermal power. And 2030 challenge is saying we have to get down to a place where there is no expense of energy to keep it running over time. So your net energy expense, what you're pulling from the grid over a year, equals what you're producing on site. And we think there's no reason not to be doing that right now.
Right now. Yep. And that's admirable. And thank you for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So looking at your website, your designs are absolutely beautiful. What would you guys say is so far was the funnest project to do and why? What did that entail? Like for someone that's thinking about becoming an architect, what is that process like? So pick a house that you really enjoy doing and kind of walk us through.
Or a project of any kind.
Oh yeah, any kind. Doesn't have to be a house.
And I am going to change it from one house to a project, and it's an ongoing project for us. For me personally, Mark might have a slightly different response to this. The most rewarding thing that we've done so far was to develop a patent, actually, for something that we're working on.
Really?
It involved a great amount of building science research, building technique research, and some historical looks back into how buildings come together. And Mark and I worked closely together, which is also rewarding, to develop this concept for a patent and submitted it. It's in process right now, so we're patent pending, but no word yet.
Exciting.
Yes.
Yep. Congratulations, though.
Thank you. The reason that was so rewarding is it felt like we were really beginning to change the paradigm. Individual projects can be very rewarding and to see them come to fruition and be completed. But at the end of the day, it's just one project. And so for us to be pioneering a whole system that can be applied at different scales, in different locations, for different types of buildings, feels like we're doing heavy lifting work by doing that and hopefully doing it successfully in the long run.
Wow,
so we're really getting to our goal
really
of
exciting.
Pushing building science forward.
That sounds amazing.
So can you tell us about what this is?
Can you give us
it's pending?
A little clue or a little...
Well, it gets pretty technical. I think it's probably best for people to examine some of the diagrams on our websites, but it's also related to what I was saying earlier about the sandwich and the different structural techniques.
Okay.
All right. So that's a little hint. Go to the website, people.
Yeah.
Check it
out. I'll also add that it actually, the idea for this all stems from a certain project. It's in Kennebunkport, and we stumbled upon this kind of building system that's out there, but it's very rare, and we implemented it in the design, and that triggered a series of cascading kind of discoveries and ways to work with that system.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it's just very exciting to have that happen to a project.
That's so exciting. I love that. Congratulations. That's such a breakthrough.
And I want to add one more thing to that, too. The reason it's meaningful, maybe specifically for me, is when we were working in firms at other companies, we didn't necessarily get to do that level of research and invention, the sort of creativity where you're literally creating something.
Wow.
We frequently, we're asked to pick up a project that had already been pushed along a little bit and sort of continue someone else's design rationale, or have to work within a pretty tight mold because that's what the company's product is. And that's one of the fact that we've been able to do this patent work and some really primary research is one of the main benefits of having our own company, which is something that's a little bit unique to architecture. If a student adjacent or is thinking about adjacent professions such as structural engineering or maybe even graphic design or other forms of design, some of them you can do independently and work for yourself. Graphic design is probably one that works more easily that way. However, something like structural engineering is really typically done in a larger firm. It just is a different work environment. So that's something to consider for students looking at their profession as well.
Right. But also, would you recommend, both of you did work for firms and then you obviously have your own. Would you recommend going that path? Starting out with your own firm out of college probably would be a big leap, I would think.
Yes, I would highly recommend working for other people. It's actually a sort of a requirement from the point of view of getting registered. You have to have your internship, your hours of experience accrued under another licensed professional.
Right, in order to sign off on projects and that sort of thing. You need those credentials. Yeah. Did you both work on some fairly large projects before you started your own company?
Yeah, I did. And I think most of that came from my time in New York City because they don't have a lot of freestanding single-story houses there.
Right. So could you talk a little bit about what maybe your biggest project was?
Let's see. The biggest project that was also significant to me was a renovation of a historic seminary in New York City to make it a hotel. And it's this old, beautiful brick building, turn of the century, or actually earlier, that we stripped away all the nasty finishes that have been put in around the 90s and exposed some of that brick. And I don't know, it's pretty simple design-wise, but the scale was large enough, and there was a lot of moving pieces. And the thing about New York and that building is if it's landmarked, which means it's a significant historical building, there's a whole process.
Right.
And that landmark process is kind of notoriously difficult.
Right.
But we got it through.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. That must have been a challenge in and of itself, for sure.
So, Annie, I know you have a lot of background in landscape architecture. Could you tell us about that?
Definitely. That's one of the things that actually has allowed me to work on the widest scale of projects as well. I became interested in the relationship between buildings and landscape and land use and communities and landscape when I was in school. And that led me down a path toward trying to work for a landscape architecture firm in Seattle. And they are doing really interesting work in a wide scale of work around the world as well. So I got to examine things like public parks, city planning projects, like creating a whole new city in certain parts of the world and working on waterfronts. And in addition to working on backyard and residential gardens. And so I think that was valuable to me to gain those additional skills of, just understanding the technical materials that are required in that kind of design, like plants and soil and irrigation, hardscaping and things like that.
That's really important. Yep.
Yeah, as well as just to have such a different relationship to projects than specifically the architect's relationship.
Wow, that must feel so exciting to be creating the beginnings of something new in a city or a park or that sort of thing.
Definitely. In a lot of ways doing, a lot of that work was public too, which is a little bit different than what we're doing now. And obviously from residential design. And public work comes with some difficulty. They're frequently more lengthy and complicated processes because of all the stakeholders and the financial backing required for public projects. But there's so much reward because it's a place where everybody can go. And they're really needed spaces in cities.
Oh, so true. And something everybody can enjoy.
Spaces.
Yeah. And lasts sometimes forever.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, hopefully. So we're getting to the point where we should wrap things up. But do either of you have any final thoughts or suggestions for anybody going into architecture?
We had one thought.
Okay, great. Good.
Which we do want to express. And if someone listening to this is thinking about going into architecture, they should just know they don't have to become a registered architect. There are many professionals who never get licensed.
Okay.
And you can work at a firm for your whole life doing that. That's no problem. You can also own your own firm. The one thing is you can never call yourself an architect, and you're also not providing architectural services.
Okay.
You're designing. That's the only thing.
That is good to know, because you might not want to do that extra work that it takes to become a registered architect.
And you're limited in what you can do. You can't sign off on most buildings, and most buildings require an architect to sign. And so you can design, for example, homes under a certain square footage in most states, but you're not going to sign on it. And it just doesn't require someone to. You can also work on any building of any size, but work closely with a registered architect who does sign on it.
Who does the signing. Yep.
To expand on that a little bit, frequently there's a term used called generalist architect within the profession at certain firms. And the firm where Mark and I met liked that term a lot because they wanted all of their employees to be generalists, to understand how to design different sorts of buildings, to be able to jump in and work on any part of a building. But frankly, in reality, that usually doesn't work that way, just by the nature of the specific experience that professionals have as they go through and different offices they work for. They generally end up having a lot more familiarity for a certain kind of building, whether that's a high-rise or a museum or a home, and also specific aspects within that building. And so I would encourage people who are interested in architecture to also remember that you can have wildly different experiences even within one office, and you can cater the profession to really anything that you're interested in. If you really care about materials, you can lean more toward the side of interior design. If you really want to work on technical things, you can work very closely with structural engineers on big projects. There's just so many different little mini lives within the umbrella of architecture.
So there's a lot of options.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's important for our listeners to know that information. And also, I just once again want to encourage people to take a look at your website. It's architectstyp.com. Please take a look at it. It's so powerful and captivating, and
it's a great
website, but also just some beautiful, we never even touched upon how artistic the two of you are, which is amazing. And you even get to enjoy some of their sketches and artwork within the website, but also some of their current projects, which are amazing. So anybody interested in working with some great architects, check that out.
Check it right out. Yeah, for sure. So usually, guys, we wrap up our podcast with 10 rapid fire questions. And I think what we'll do this time is we'll alternate. So you each do 5 instead of both of you answering each question. So
we're letting them off easy, Bobby.
Yeah, we are. We are. But who wants to start?
I'll start.
Go for it, Annie.
Okay, here we go, Annie. What are 3 words you would use to describe yourself?
Take your time. Energetic, quick, and loves food. That's 4.
That's awesome.
I like that. Okay. All right, Mark, then this one is for you. If you weren't an architect, what would you be?
I think in reality I would be a computer scientist, but I wish I was a pilot flying helicopters.
There you go. Okay. I love that, Mark. Hey, you can still do that.
Right. There's always time.
You can always do that.
Totally unexpected, that answer.
All right, Annie. If you could sit down for a chat with anyone dead or alive, who would it be?
President Barack Obama.
Oh my gosh, that's the second time we got that just recently, and I totally get it. I would love to sit down with him as well. Okay, Mark, if you could live in another time, when would that be?
Oh, it would have to be in the future. Oh my gosh.
There you go. Yeah.
I'm very future oriented. And also I just feel generally that the past tends to have been kind of a horrible, like a really difficult time to be.
Yeah. Right. There's no time you could pick that wasn't something going on that was, Yeah. But I'd be fascinated to know what the future holds too. Okay, Annie. Current favorite movie or TV show, or one you've seen recently that you loved?
Oh, I loved The West Wing. I cannot say enough good things.
Do you know how many times I've watched The West Wing?
That's a great
I've watched it twice all the way through.
We have. Oh, we have. It might even be 3. I mean, I don't even know for sure, but I just love the writing in that, Aaron Sorkin. I mean,
very clever. Great writing. Yeah.
I just love the West Wing.
A really fascinating window into politics. Like if someone was considering working anywhere in politics or government, I would say watch that show.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, did you see Newsroom? Because he did Newsroom too, and that was pretty darn good as well.
I'll check it out.
I recommend it. Okay, we're back to you, Mark. Country or rock?
Oh, rock. And Annie and I, this was a major point of contention outside of our relationship.
Yeah.
But
I'm country, 100%.
Country.
Oh, you're country. Okay.
I've come to appreciate it, but my answer is firmly rock.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you both have a different answer, though. That's perfect.
I know. Well, it's very nice that you've come to appreciate it, Mark. Okay, Annie, dog or cat?
Dog. Dog.
All right, that was emphatic.
No doubt there.
Quibbling. Right. Mark, paper book or ebook?
Ebook. I thought I was a paper book guy until I tried a Kindle recently, and I love it. It's great.
Yeah. They are great. It's easier to fly with.
It's funny how many people have answered paper book, but you got to wonder if they've tried a Kindle.
Maybe they just haven't tried it. They don't know what they're
Yeah.
Also, maybe they haven't had to move all their books recently. They're heavy.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Right?
If you want to travel with a lot of books, it's nice. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Annie, iPhone or Droid?
Oh, iPhone for me. Definitely iPhone.
Okay.
However, this is evolving as well. Mark is definitely Droid. It's interesting or I should not Droid, but Google phone. For a lot of these answers, we are split, but we appreciate each other's approach.
Yeah. Well, just so
that
nice.
That is so nice. Yeah.
You can be respectful.
Yeah.
All right, Mark. First thing you do when you wake up.
What do I do?
Check your phone and make coffee.
Here's what I think the very first thing I do, besides look at my phone, is turn on the hot water pot to make coffee because I need that pronto.
Yeah, you need that caffeine to get you going. All right, you two, you made it through the very tough rapid fire questions. And
thank you.
We feel grilled.
Grilled and survived. But thank you so much, Mark Keller and Annelise Aldrich, for coming on the podcast today and sharing all about what it's like to be an architect. I know this is super valuable to our listeners. And again, just want to remind everybody to go check out TYP Architects. You won't regret it.
Well, thanks so much for having us. This is a wonderful show that you're doing, and we hope that it's informative for some people.
Definitely.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be. And I want to thank you guys for being on the cutting edge of bringing us into a better, sustainable situation.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that.
Bobby.
Hey, everybody have a great day.
Thanks so much.
What a wonderful couple Mark and Annie are. They're going to change the world.
Yeah, I think they are. They're well on their way. Well, or at least they're going to change the way we look at building.
For sure.
We are so appreciative of Mark and Annie coming on the podcast to share all of their wonderful knowledge.
We certainly are. Anyone wishing to contact Mark and Annie should head on over to their website, Architects TYP.com, or go to their LinkedIn page or Instagram. We'll include all of those links in the show notes.
Yep, we will. And thanks again for tuning in, everyone.
Yes, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps us out.
No joke, it definitely does. Also, if you could be so kind as to leave us a rating or even a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, that would be fabulous.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and have a wonderful day.
Have a great day, y'all.